Hello, listeners. Good to have you back. This is another episode of Tu Esquina Filosófica. And today we're going to be talking about someone very interesting, someone who has been primarily obscured from history, even though he was quite active and productive in his life, especially in movements towards socialism. He wasn't necessarily a philosopher, but the work we're going to be going over today is quite philosophical in nature. It is the work of leftists. It is the second most translated leftist work in history, behind only the Communist Manifesto. And as you guys know from the title, the work we will be going over today is The Right to Be Lazy by Paul Lafargue. Lafargue comes from Haitian grandparents. His grandparents moved to Cuba in 1804 after the Haitian Revolution. Lafargue was born in Santiago de Cuba in 1842. And as a kid, he moved to France to study in secondary. When he got to medical school and he was a medical student in the 60s, he got involved with Proudhonian anarchist movements. And only after a couple years of being in the movement, he was forced to move to Spain. Shortly after, he met Marx and started loosening up his Proudhonian anarchism. In 1865, after participating in a students' movement in France, he got expelled from all French universities, forcing him to move to London to work. In London, he became a regular visitor at Marx's house and eventually married his daughter, Laura Marx. As a general council member of the First International, he was appointed to Spain, and it was only after the Catalonian anarchist revolution of 1868 happened that he was able to get Spain to join the First International. In his time in Spain, he tried to spread the Marxist framework as best as he could, but he kept on clashing with the Spanish utmost support for anarchism. Eventually, he went back to France and opened up the first ever Marxist party in France, called the French Workers' Party. In 1811, he dies by his own hand, and his suicide is actually probably one of the most famous things that people know about him now, which is that he committed suicide along with his wife, Laura Marx. On his last note, he stated, and I quote, "Healthy in body and in mind, I end my life before pitiless old age, which has taken upon me my pleasures and joys one after another, and which has been stripping me of my physical and mental powers, paralyzing my energy, breaking my will, making me a burden to myself and others. For some years I have promised myself not to live beyond 70, and I have fixed the exact year for my departure from life. I prepared the method for the execution of our resolution. It was a hypodermic of cyanide acid. I die with the supreme joy of knowing that at some future time, the cause which I have been fighting for 45 years will triumph. Long live communism, long live the Second International." In his funeral, Vladimir Lenin, a good friend of his, spoke and said, "If one cannot work for the party any longer, one must be able to look truth in the face and die like the Lafargues." Lafargue's life and work was dedicated to the advancements of socialism. Although a full-pledged Marxist in affirmation and constantly critiquing anarchism, in his work what we get is a synthesis of both, a sort of anarcho-communism. In fact, even though he had great achievements as a revolutionary in his life, he was mostly forgotten after his death, and it was the anarchists, specifically the Wobblies, who started circling his works like The Right to Be Lazy underground, resurging his popularity in the same anarchist circles he was always in, yet also always critical of. Now let's jump into the book. The book, again, it's a small book. It was more so a pamphlet, an essay. It's called The Right to Be Lazy. Chapter 1, A Disastrous Dogma. Here he states that there is a delusion of the love for work which is dragging humanity into individual and social woes. The source of this aspiration of work as good has its hegemonic sources in capitalists, their academic ethicists, the economists, and priests. Work in capitalist society, he states, is the source of all intellectual degeneracy and organic deformity. In the most primitive communities, and in the most intellectually developed, like Spain and ancient Greece, they hold contempt for work, many considering that work is only to be done by slaves, that a free man does not work, and a man that works is not free. Many consider idleness a gift from the gods. The proletariat, the class which in freeing itself will free humanity from servile toil and will make of the human animal a free being, betrays its instincts, despising its historical mission, has let itself be perverted by the dogma of work. Rude and terrible has been the punishment. All its individual and social woes are born of its passion to work. Chapter 2 is called The Blessing of Work. He states that the ideological machine that promotes work as good and the avoidance of vice can be seen as early as 1770 in an anonymous pamphlet called Essays on Trade and Commerce. The author of this says that to rule out laziness and to curb the sentiments of pride and independence that come from it, one must create workhouses. Consider them houses of terror, where toilers work 14 hours a day. This was the ideal for philanthropists and moralists at the time. The toiling masses end up imprisoned, working a dozen hours a day, walking miles home and to work, just to continue the same tradition on a daily basis. They, the workers, then paradoxically proclaim the right to work, the hegemonic acceptance which calls the endless toil they are going through a virtue. It is like a perverted sadomasochism. The thing which brings them pain and suffering, that being work, is the thing they in turn ask for the most. In times of crisis, instead of storming and being free, they go beg for a job. He states that a lot of the churches promoted this endless work so that the government did not have to enforce it with laws. It is easier to promote work when the source of promotion is the satisfaction of hunger. That's the paradox. In poorer nations, people seem to be more free and content. In wealthier nations, when there is constant endless work, we see a misery of the soul. Enforcing work through laws requires too much effort. Now, enforcing it through hunger is peaceful, silent, and effortless. The law of capitalist production is for the proletariat to work, and as he is working, he is making himself poorer and more miserable while continuously working with the conception that work, the thing digging them into this hole, is what will get them out. When the workers can't pay for the things they make, they give them credit, and now they'll pay the debt as best as they can through work. It gets to the point that the worker asks the capitalist, "Give us work," but not for hunger, but because the lack of work itself is tormenting them. Most of the work is essentially useless. Most things get tossed and never used or even bought. In terms of control, though, it is a lot better to have the worker constantly toiling than in a situation where they only toil the things that will be consumed. In the latter, they are free, and with that freedom comes a greater ability to disconnect from the capitalist hegemony and consequentially from capitalism itself. Lafargue proclaims the right to work, the right amount of work should be 3 hours. In doing so, instead of work being physically and mentally exhausting, work is used as a condiment to our leisure time and thus can actually satisfy us. It will become a beneficial exercise to the human organism. Chapter 3 is called The Consequence of Overproduction. He states, and I quote, "The blind, perverse, and murderous passion for work transforms the liberating machine into an instrument for the enslavement of free men. Its productiveness impoverishes them. As machines get better and more efficient at doing humans' work, instead of the human working less, the worker seems to be in a constant competition with the machine, and paradoxically works even more than before because of the machine. It is murderous competition. At the time when man's material necessities and excess of work are competing against highly efficient machines, is when they preach to the worker Malthusian theory, the religion of abstinence and the dogma of work. The harder and more miserable the work of the worker becomes, the less work and more forced enjoyment the capitalist in turn gets. Overproduction of worker forces the capitalist into overconsumption. As the worker toils in misery, the capitalist has transformed from a group that was normal and consumed based on necessity to a group that has a constant push towards consuming luxuriously, as if to, in their heads, give meaning to the overproduction of the laborer. In this process, the capitalists lose their essence and become fat and unhealthy overall, and slaves of their constant consumption. A good amount of labor just goes into satisfying this luxurious life of the capitalist. As labor becomes harder and the loss of passions for the working class people disappear, the more the capitalist avoids work and adheres to constant pleasure satisfaction. Armies like guards, policemen, magistrates are there to defend the capitalist from the enemy within, that being the unsatisfied and overexploited proletariat. The national armies are really just mercenaries. They are there to protect against revolts and to ensure that the capitalist class does not have to work the 10 hours they make those revolting work. The problem of capitalists is no longer to find the producer, rather to find the consumer that satisfies their overproduction. Since the worker who makes the things can't buy them, the capitalist is forced to travel to the four corners of the world to sell their commodities. The productiveness of European production eventually defies all consumption and turns into waste. Products are produced to be sold easily and to last less. Thus, he calls this the age of adulteration, and its sole motivation is profit for capitalists, producing shitty goods, and worthless, constant labor for the worker. Instead of working, like was done at the time, 12 to 14 hours for 6 months a year, why not guarantee a whole year of work, but instead 4 to 6 hours? That way, everyone can be employed at once, and the competition for work among laborers is destroyed. Paul states that there is sufficient proof that less work and more pay and more rest days increases the strength of human production. These long work hours leave men as only parts of men. Machine development must correlate to less work and higher pay for the laborer. Paradoxically, not only does it not do that, but the laborer himself has bought into the capitalist hegemonic idea that labor is a virtue, and instead of demanding less work and more pay, demands more work. Chapter 4 is labeled New Songs to New Music. A consumerist productive class will relieve the owning class from consumption duty, and thus they will stop employing unproductive labor that is just used to satisfy bourgeois luxury. Those laborers will now have to join the productive workforce, and to have enough to feed them, they will have to stop shipping abroad. Regulations will eventually come in and dictate work for all. The proletariat will then thus take up the consumption habits that belonged only to the bourgeois before. The previous ideological proponents of the work ethic will be tortured 4 times a year through starvation and candles. The capitalist class will take the most unsavory jobs or just beg in the street. It will be the communists and the collectivists that will feast and live in leisure. Again, we have to remember this is a satirical text that was meant to get people essentially rallied up. We will use the lawyers and other tools of the establishment as carnival animals for our constant theaters. The politicians will be dressed as clowns and made to dance and speak their same BS rhetoric as they did before. He finishes this chapter with a concluding quote that says, "If uprooting from its heart the vice which dominates it and degrades its nature, the working class were to arise in its terrible strength, not to demand the rights of man, which are but the right of capitalist exploitation, not to demand the right to work, which is but the right to misery, but to forge a brazen law forbidding any man from working more than 3 hours a day. The earth, the old earth, trembling with joy, would feel a new universe leaping within her." That is how he concludes the book, and then in the appendix he goes on to say a few more things. In the appendix he refers to the ancient Greek philosophers and their disdain for work. He also goes on and gives the counter-argument of current philosophers, which is that all those ancient philosophers accepted slavery, and thus the freedom of the citizenry from working was because they accepted slavery. But Paul questioned this and says that isn't wage labor the current form of slavery, and isn't the citizenry that is enjoying leisure merely the capitalist class, the Rothschilds and others? He asks if it's not possible to have an envision of a leisure freedom with the conditions of present time, with the machinery that allows us to have a life of primarily leisure. He states that we have made Aristotle's dream a reality with our productive machines. And he quotes Aristotle and says that, given that Aristotle foresaw that, quote, that if every tool could by itself execute its proper function, as the masterpieces of Daedalus move themselves, or as the tripods of Vulcan set themselves spontaneously at their scared work, if, for example, the shuttles of weavers did their own weaving, the foreman of the workshop would have no more need of helpers, nor the master of slaves. The genius of capitalist philosophers remains dominated by the prejudice of wage slavery, similarly to the ancient Greek philosophers' prejudice of their form of slavery. They don't understand that the machine is the savior of humanity, what will materialize a society by what God has given men, leisure and liberty. That is the text, essentially. As I said, it's meant to be a satire. Now I'm going to give a few short statements on what I think of the work. On a positive note, I think he was able to foresee a shift in the working class towards the same hyper-consumerism of the capitalist class of his time. On a non-positive note, although this work was meant to be a satire, I think focusing on the hegemonic ideological conditioning of the working class as the source of evil is kind of victim blaming, given that they are not in direct control of their situation when the alternative to work is starvation. In doing so, it blames the material conditions of the working class on the working class's acceptance of capitalist hegemony. I consider this a backwards analysis. It is only after forced toil of capitalist production creates the proletariat that the proletariat is conditioned to accept the dogma of the virtue of the fruitlessness of the toil they partake in. There is also presented, I believe, a false dichotomy between the capitalist exploitative work and leisure time. First, there are activities done in our non-capitalist productive work which ought to be considered work as well, not just leisure. For example, work that is done at home, although not paid and monetarily valued in capitalist society, is itself work, not leisure. Secondarily, he attributes the misery of the soul that comes from working to working itself. In doing so, I believe he ignores the alienation of the worker that arises from capitalist exploitation. This alienation is not specifically from the work itself. It is from the disconnection of the work and the product of the work to the laborer. Although there is an immense lack of fruitfulness in the constant industrial factory work, I believe the conditions surrounding the work being done is more influential to the effect on the worker than the work itself. To end on a positive note, Lafargue is able to correctly identify the paradox of the development of more efficient machinery with the maintenance of labor conditions. Although the work hours have shortened from 12 to 8 and the pay has increased, the proportion of that in correlation with the tremendous increase in the productiveness of our machines demonstrates this paradox that Lafargue is referring to. This is that instead of better and more productive machinery, meaning less work and more pay for the laborer, what has turned out to be is a dramatic increase in productivity in the machines while only having a mediocre improvement in working conditions. Lafargue, although presenting us with certain inconsistencies, reminds us that technological development in the productive forces must correlate and be aimed at an improvement in the conditions of human beings as well. Development in things that does not correlate with the development in human relations helps us realize that the development is either useless and thus cannot be considered development, or that the beneficiaries of this development is just a very small group which is disconnected from the processes through which these developments become materialized. And that's all for today. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tu Esquina Filosófica. If you enjoyed, please drop a like, a comment, or subscribe, as well as if you have anyone who might be interested in similar topics, recommend my channel to a friend or to a family member. This is Carlos signing out. Peace.